In 2000, we convened a number of town hall meetings, and the premier speakers were John Makumbe, myself, and Masipula Stole. And then, of course, we had Lovemore Maduku, Ben Tlachwayo, Welshman Ngube, Priscilla Misaira Bwimshonga, Margaret Dongo, Toko Mache, Lydia Zgomonyatsanza, Emi Tsanga, and a couple of other people over time. The basic analysis, given the context of the year 2000, loss in the referendum for ZANU-PF, furious start to the fast-track land reform program, which was attended by quite a lot of violence, is that it was correct at that time to suggest that what made the difference in the 9-month-old MDC getting only 4 seats shy of ZANU-PF in the National Assembly was the margin of terror as opposed to the margin of error. That you could actually track the difference, the 4 seats, Uzumba, Maramba, Fungwa, and I think it was Marsh East and the Marsh Central constituencies, was the extent of violence that had happened in those constituencies. Hence Masipula Stole's famous article on the margin of error versus margin of terror. And I think that thesis must be understood in the context of something that John Makumbe and Kempton Makamure at the time said. Kempton Makamure suggested that a rigging of elections was happening through cutting grass, which sounded so out of it, right? But what he meant is that in certain instances, young people were being given menial jobs within urban settings, and that these menial jobs, plus cash, alcohol, and other inducements, explained part of the voter or voting patterns. And then John Makumbe focused more on, and it's captured in the book Behind the Smoke Screen, focused more on how gerrymandering, which is the changing of constituency boundary or manipulation of the same, changing of electoral laws last minute, and also generally the administration of the election itself, which is how and where election materials were printed and how they were transmitted, and also the process of transmission of voters, tabulation of votes, vote counting, and etc. were key. I think to understand at the time, my argument seemed very simple, and it was that the observation seemed to be the resilience of populations in those constituencies where there had been significant violence, and also certain factors that had inhibited constituencies where violence was predicted from being violent. So we had, for example, Chikomba, where General Solomon Mjuru gathered all of us, ZANU-PF, war veterans, civil society, and the MDC, and indicated that because he was from Chikomba, there would be no violence. And you'll note that actually Chikomba remains relatively peaceful. In contrast, where Mashonaland East, which is Marondera East and West, was significantly violent. And if one considers what that means in terms of the question of individual leadership and distinction on the basis of constituency and what the stakes are in each constituency became key. And I will tie all this up just now. So certain constituencies were important, not only because of who was contesting, but some of them held a historical significance to particular political actors and parties, tied to the War of Liberation, tied to traditional beliefs, tied to all sorts of things. Our politics is very complex. I think that we tend to use bifocal or unifocal analysis when we're looking at what dynamics play out within constituencies. So clearly, if you, in some, Mashonaland Central, where Bodagezi had established what later on became known as Green Bombers, became a self-styled one-party zone, as had Masvingo previously under Edson Mdadirwa Shobwo and even Ungwe. So it was a highly factionalized ZANU-PF territory, but a territory all the same where the joint attempt to stop oppositional penetration was key. And traditionally, as you know, the constituencies in Matabeleland South, Matabeleland North, and Bulawayo had voted since 1980 for ZAPU, and then later on for other incarnations of the opposition. And then, of course, there was a curious case of indeterminate polling stations, plus mobile polling stations. And so in a sense, if you have 11,000 polling stations and you are the opposition and you want to monitor elections in all 11,000, and these elections are taking place over 2 days with the likelihood of extension, and as happened at that time in 2000, 2002, and then 2008, there were significant delays in certain areas. And of course, you had power outages in others, and etc. Is that you would need monitors, at least 4 monitors for election, or whatever you call them, polling agents, party agents, at a polling station, so that they take turns. When one goes to the toilet, someone is watching. When they take lunch and meal breaks. And these folks would also, of course, need time to be able to communicate with their base, etc. The sheer expense of observing, monitoring, being vigilant over what happens with votes in particular counting centers, in particular constituencies, and etc., began to increase. And so the competitive and comparative advantage would lie with whoever has state's resources. And you didn't need to do much actually to circumvent the system. And of course, you know, that's why biometric voting was never really fully implemented, because the assumption was, in part, it would reduce the human agency where folks, because of party affiliation, might feel inclined either for overall party interest or very specific constituency or ward interests to conduct themselves in a manner as to favor their political party. So, in a sense, the violence, both on the commercial farms and the violence in rural areas that were deemed contested because of the rise of the opposition, or that the certain elements within the ruling party wanted deeply safeguarded, together with the control over rural district councils and urban councils, as well as central government and the security apparatus, essentially meant that a well-coordinated effort combining these factors and forces, especially those that had become politicized or partisan in a particular way, would enable you to have real-time intelligence and assessment of where things were going wrong, where you were likely to lose, and then would also give you the opportunity to rectify any potential losses. And that is the real danger in terms of thinking about what it means to run an election. So, in short, urban voter turnout, if you increased, so the total number of registered urban voters, you ask yourself first, over the last 4 elections, of the total registered urban voters, how many have turned out to vote? Then you ask yourself, of the total potential number of voters in urban areas, how many have actually registered? Then you actually even go further and ask yourself, of the total number of urban voters who were registered, who didn't pitch up to vote? What percentage is that? And what does that translate to in absolute numbers by constituency? So don't even use 100% because it's rare for an election to have a 97% or 100% turnout. I would work with a maximum threshold of about 90%, maybe, if I wishful thinking, 95% if there's massive mobilization. You will realize that that has been more meaningful, has had a more meaningful impact than the rural constituencies that we often blame. And in part, you will actually realize that the increase in rural areas, even rural areas where there's been violence, of voters, either for the opposition or independent candidates, has actually been impressive in very difficult circumstances. If that is correct, you will have 2 distinctions. The first distinction is that in the presidential election, where it's simply a head count across a whole country, you can change the outcome by changing the extent of urban voter turnout and the percentage per constituency. That means your mobilization needs to be thorough. Obviously, you will need some rural votes, significant number of rural votes, but mostly the opposition loses this game, is likely to lose this game in urban settings. This analysis doesn't apply necessarily constituencies. The factors that determine how voting happens in constituencies and the influence of violence in constituencies, as well as gerrymandering and other forms of. So the constituency-based vote or MP vote is slightly different. In the constituency-based vote, the factors are totally different. So if there is localized violence in a constituency, the levels of vulnerability of the voter and the ability to influence the voter to vote for a particular member of parliament is much higher. So both coercive means as well as inducements, such as bribery, fraud, food aid, agricultural inputs, and etc., would have at a constituency level and voting for a member of parliament or a councillor, that would have an impact. And so if you focus in any election purely on the presidential, which is the head count, that's always almost winnable for any opposition, and the strategy is different for the MP. It doesn't necessarily follow that when your presidential candidate is doing well, your member of parliament and councillors are also doing well. It also doesn't necessarily follow that if you're a member of parliament and your councillors are doing well, your presidential candidate will do well. And this is why you almost need a 3-tier strategy, because the choices being made by the voters are slightly more complicated, especially where you need higher turnouts as opposed to the traditional party base. And that's why I think, yes, violence matters. Yes, the role that militaries and other entities matter, especially for determining who becomes member of parliament. And that's, of course, is key to the question of retaining a 2/3 majority in parliament, winning or whittling it down, and etc. But when you are determining who becomes president, a totally different factor comes into play. Is the candidate sellable? And so if you look at voter patterns for the last couple of elections, and not just Boram Sango, if you look even at the last election in 2018, you realize that there is no correlation necessarily between those folks who voted for Mnangagwa his poor performance against Chamisa, and those who voted for ZANU-PF, and its unusually high performance in terms of the member of parliament performance. Why do I say high performance? So in 1980, ZANU-PF did not garner as high a percentage of the parliament as it did in the 2018 election and 2013 election. The irony of ironies, of course, some people remind me, is that Mugabe got much higher votes in 2013 than he had in 1980 in terms of just per capita, right? And yet he was a victim of a coup d'etat 4 years later. I hazard these things in order to take us away from oversimplified analysis that says that just the one factor determines the outcome. Those of you who are worried about statecraft, of course, will ask a much more fundamental question. What's the point of having a president if the parliament is going to belong to another party? This, of course, should push us all to be thinking about what sort of unusual alliances are possible coming out of an election or ahead of an election. And I call them unusual because they're not predictably people who are of the same mind, but it is questions around what will it take to govern the nation, since it's clear that you are not going to have total victory for one side or the other, or either side. As well as no matter how much people love a ruling party or an opposition party, there's always going to be other people who don't feel as enamored. So if you consider this, you then have to ask, what is it that my earlier post was about? My earlier post was, well, if you consider the 2000 election with all the violence that attended, and you look first at the urban votes, the winning candidates for the opposition won with some 20,000, 26,000, some 30-something thousand. Over the next 3 elections, even where the opposition retained these seats, the winning candidates were winning by 9,000 votes, maybe 12. Those who were doing well, maybe 15. That's a reduction on average of 10,000 votes. If you look at the percentage voter turnout that was in 2000 for the June election, the voter turnout was still not ideal because it was below 68% for most of the constituencies in the urban areas. But it was the absolute number was significantly higher. That turnout dipped, and that's the analysis I'm asking people. Don't believe me, do the analysis for yourself. Take the 35 to 40 something odd urban constituencies, plot it on a graph over the last 4 elections, and ask yourself, what did the winning candidate get for this election? So whilst there's been moderate increases in votes, like for the ruling party in some urban constituencies, and for the opposition in raw constituencies, you will notice another interesting trend, that it is actually the decline in urban areas, especially for the presidential election, because in the presidential election it's a head count. So if you say whether or not you take the position that the last election was hijacked or rigged, the vote difference between Chamisa and Mnangagwa in the declared election was less than 300,000 votes. Now, you can account for those 300,000 votes purely by reference to potential urban voter difference, and for those of you who are interested in maths, and you ask yourself, if you were using predictive technology or algorithms, how might you end up with votes of that nature? I keep jokingly saying to friends that if you took just 2,900 votes per constituency and you multiplied that by the 210 constituencies, you might get an interesting number, right? And you then you then divide that by the number of wards to just get a sense of how many, if one were doing creative rigging, how many votes that would translate to per ward. So let me repeat that. traditional rigging methods were that people would be looking for a place where there would be massive stuffing of one ballot. Of course, in our country, this issue of postal votes, this issue of vote by security forces and others remains contentious and opaque because nobody knows. Sometimes there are not enough monitors to vouch for the fact that their vote is free, fair, and etc. But that aside, I'm suggesting that if one is looking across all constituencies and then just doing basic mathematics, so if you don't want to use a funny number, use 3,000. 3,000 votes per constituency times 210 constituencies. And if you think 3,000 votes per constituency, then ask yourself how many wards are in a constituency. Then divide 3,000 by that number. So that's what you need to upset any electoral outcome even in constituencies where folks don't win. And that's why sometimes you end up with wards strewn across the country that have the exact same number of votes. And it's curious and you can't explain it. But I think it's machines doing their business. And I think it will be useful to look at that. So let me go back to the question of elections and structures. So I think we often blame chiefs, but what we forget is that during the liberation struggle, as part of fighting against the fascist, racist regime of Ian Smith, there was set up structures, and immediately after independence, in pursuit of socialist policies and, of course, a developmental state agenda, we set up village development committees, ward development committees, district, provincial committees. Mostly they were both security and ruling party committees. And these were responsible for much more than elections. They were responsible, of course, for intelligence gathering. They were responsible for welfare. They were also responsible for all forms of distribution and redistribution within the rural economy. And if you combine this with the, of course, overall security apparatus, you will realize that whilst traditional chiefs, of course, were key in the identification of households and etc., their role must be appreciated in the context of an ecosystem that included traditional leadership, security apparatus, which would really be, if you like, party activists, cum security, cum business people. So the penetration levels using structure might become much easier, at least for the ruling party. Oppositional structures took root in certain geographies, but in other geographies, of course, the dilemma you had was it was not fully appreciated that you cannot implement a political program without a structure. And that therefore the issue of coherence of structure was not just mobilizational, but it was that ability to connect on a continuous basis with the broad mass and to connect beyond, if you like, rallies, and also to connect beyond elections. So the business of political programs, which would cover welfare, which would also cover communication, education, and information, was key. Clearly, I mean, it's a miracle that over the years, given first the policy of no-go areas, where rural areas were declared no-go areas for opposition, and then later on, the attrition that happened within the opposition itself, with or without the effect of infiltration, and of course other factors that are related to the economy, the economic state of the country, and basic social state of the country, are such that the key questions of organizing, mobilizing, information, education, and communication, and the role of structures and consciousness and awareness building in that remain a challenge for, I think, the ruling party as it does for the opposition more so. And this means there's always a radical need to reimagine structure. However, in this analysis that we're doing, Tendai and I and a few other people, because we had been both lawyers of the ZCTU, Tendai before me, and I was lawyer of the ZCTU and the early MDC in the as you went into 2000 and immediately after the election. We'd made certain observations, and these observations were that the real difference, and that explained part of the method of the fast-track land reform process, is that the real difference is that you had 500,000 farm workers on the commercial, white commercial farms, as they were called then. And on average, if one assumes that each has a family of between 3 to 5, the estimates were from GAPUS, were that, which is the General and Plantation Workers Union of Zimbabwe, was that you had 1.5 million residents on the farms, black residents on the farms, so itinerant workers and some semi-permanent workers. If you were looking at the assumption that ZANU-PF could retain rural areas through the use of the security and traditional leadership apparatus, they were not guaranteed the middle vote, which was the general plantation workers, or workers on the agricultural workers, if you like, on commercial farms. And if one assumes that there were at least 1 million of those voters, and you add to that the urban population, which had become very restive, and by indication of the voting patterns in the referendum, seemed to have moved towards the opposition, it was clear that bar something dramatic, ZANU-PF was bound to suffer not just urban loss, but urban, peri-urban, and in some instances, rural losses. And so the violence, in part, I think, obviated this embarrassment, which was a growing phenomenon. And the gerrymandering assisted bringing some of the rural voters, as well as extending certain constituencies, rural voters into urban areas, as well as extending certain constituencies, making them so large and unwieldy, and others being fragmented, so that you couldn't establish what the minimum and upper threshold of a constituency is. One would have assumed 24,000, and that you would not allow a constituency to go beyond a certain number. So let's say, for argument's sake, 30,000. So some constituencies fall way below. And also there's the question of the, if you like, geospatial coverage of a constituency. So Chirumanzu, Zimbabwe, and some of those other constituencies were very wide. Once a constituency starts going beyond 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers, or some 100 kilometers, then, and it covers resettlement areas, it becomes difficult for anybody other than with access to state resources and, if you like, logistical support to cover those. So if you were to settle this case, what am I challenging economists, analysts, number crunchers here to do? It's a simple exercise. Take the last 4 elections, start with 2000, plot. I know they were harmonized elections, but I'd like you, for purposes of seeing trends, if you plot them as different color lines per constituency, or across a cluster of constituencies in a province, and then just ask, plot the performance in numbers of ZANU-PF, of the leading 2 opposition entities. Say, how was the performance per council? What was the performance per parliament? and also for the presidential election. So you'll see some of the things that I've tried to highlight. And then you do your extrapolation that says, what are we seeing as are real trends? You look at performance of the opposition in urban areas in absolute number terms, because you can get a sense that certain parties keep winning. ZANU keeps winning in rural areas. But is this translating into growth in votes? Are we seeing a diminution or reduction in votes that ZANU-PF is getting in rural areas? Are we seeing an increase in votes by ZANU-PF or by before the MDC, now Triple C, in certain constituencies? Because it then allows us to analyze the gray areas outside of our simplified notions of what the pattern, what the motivation. It then gets us to ask difficult questions about what might it take to mobilize for the next election? What is the transformative value added? And what can you do, whether you are sitting in the diaspora, you are a communicator, you are a policy person, you are a business person, what might be your best contribution to ensure that this election is not a repeat of the trends that you will have analyzed? Well, your observations may be fair in two senses. I think let's put this out of the way, because I think that as Zimbabweans we like to have false arguments about things we don't disagree on. Has there been foreign interference? There has, but it's not just been on the opposition side, it's been on the ruling party side as well. So NICUV is a foreign entity, it's not a revolutionary entity, it's an Israeli entity. And the overt actions of the Americans, the British, the Europeans, some almost openly partisan, in support of oppositional positions. So let's get that out of the way, so that we're not, at least I'm not one to build a church around things that are incontestable. My position is supremely anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and I'm unapologetic in that. But I would also like us not to paper over things. So 3,700 folk died in what we call political violence, electoral violence. There have been findings by the courts on the execution of Chiminya by Mwale. Mwale was a security person. That's not disputed. There have been other killings that actually haven't raised. And within ZANU-PF itself, there have been allegations and counter-allegations of violence, including more recently what led to the former Minister of State Security, Madondo, being suspended. And the allegations by ZANU-PF is that he had sponsored or facilitated or enabled armed people to interfere with internal party voting processes. So to be even-handed, I think we would be disingenuous for any of us to deny foreign interference. It would also, or foreign interests, actually, that is what we can establish. It will be disingenuous for us also to deny that when heads of the military say they will not allow anyone except a person with Liberation War credentials to be president. That's extraordinary. It's extraordinary in any other liberation context, but it's also overt interference. So if we consider those things plus court judgments are evidence, if you think the subjective, well, look, I join issue with you on that. We'll not agree on that. I think the best way to argue about what it will take to have proper elections is not to have a whataboutism when I think the issue of what do NGOs do, what they can't do. I mean, the average budget of most NGOs is less than $200,000. Those that are generously endowed perhaps will get to $800,000. Most of their activity actually are not focused on elections. Very few have that competence. Are there some whose narrative is problematic? Yes, there are. I mean, in as much as I think that whether you support MDC or ZANU-PF, there are certain folks within those institutions whose narratives are problematic, whether it's a narrative on violence, it's a narrative on the state, a narrative on women, a narrative. And I think that this platform is called Objective Business and Politics. We're supposed to openly say, okay, as those who don't claim to be totally neutral, but as those who are objective about our national condition, what is it that ails our system? I don't think it's rocket science to say that we run shambolic elections. Before, people would blame Ndede, and none, I mean, including ZANU-PF people, could claim that Ndede ran pristine elections, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have the sort of challenges that we had, including in ruling party primaries. I think our politics generally is both militarized and militaristic. It's violent, and even in the context of parties, and by parties I mean both ruling and opposition parties, tendencies of fraudulent behavior are pervasive. So what I'm questioning is the psyche, our collective psyche. Because if we're going to transform the condition we find ourselves in, we've actually got to say that we often don't get the best leaders. We get those leaders who are able to pay their way or beat their way to power. If you don't mind, I will not attempt to be an expert on this particular incident. I think this post for me was about elections. If you'd like, I can apply my mind, investigate more the incident you're talking about. If you don't mind, you can share the facts with me. I can triangulate and have some analysis. I don't want to give off-the-cuff analysis of those incidents. And also, I don't want to drag many things into what I think was a simple conversation on a very complex matter of what has been the trend in our elections, what are the factors. And if you listened carefully, I didn't just say violence was a factor, I referred to other factors. And I know that most people hear what they think is most prominent in what is being said. Well, I've been curious about that, but I think that I've asked on my Twitter feed over the last couple of months, and if not years now, about whether the increase in conflicts in certain parts of the continent are naturally occurring or contrived. But let me give you 3 anecdotes, and I must hasten to add, these are not evidence, right? That when we are approaching an election, political actors repurpose funds intended for certain things towards ensuring or securing power. So there is an internal dimension which is diversion of resources to ensure that particular critical constituencies are won. That's a political mortgaging or investment. But because a lot of the money that shows up our economies is speculative, depending on the reading of the speculators, sometimes there's a divestment in very subtle ways from the economy as people await outcomes or as they project what they think would be the outcome. There's a third factor, and I'm not one given to uber conspiratorial theories, but the economic hitman theory, which is that actually in certain contexts it's easy to engineer crisis so that crisis catalyzes particular narratives. But I think in our context and with respect to currency and other factors, it's been a combination of several factors, including incompetence, intransigence, and poor calculation. I think many people forewarned that the economic fundamentals were shaky or not present for the sort of monetary policies that we opted for. And I think that a coincidence of these factors may be what's at play. But because I said these are anecdotes, I'm I'm happy to be corrected, and I will be the first one to admit that I'm wrong. I don't wish to pronounce myself as an authority on this, but I think I leave more knowledgeable people on this particular subject to research, to explore further, and to offer us evidence. Yeah, on this particular one, I'm not that knowledgeable. I've been traveling over the last few days. I expressed my condolences with the Alis because I know the family from years back. Events over the last couple of days I'm not entirely familiar with. As I said, look, I'm happy to receive evidence, and I'm also happy to receive education, and I think this is what this platform is about. We share information. My instinctive position on violence is it is not a solution to anything. It is a lie. It destroys that which it purports to build. Having said that, without knowing the specificities of the situation, I cannot pronounce myself on it.